Welcome back to this coaching program course. I'm Dr. Carrie Mankey, and this is part 5, Relationships and Intimacy. Now, you may be wondering, why do we talk about this in a trauma coaching course? But often I have found in my work and in talking with other trauma survivors that when somebody's been through trauma, it shows up in every area of your life, in the workplace, in the relationship you have with your kids, your significant others, with friends, everything really, how you go about your day. But it really shows up a lot in relationships and how we set boundaries, how we relate to ourselves. And a lot of times a traumatic experience or having trauma in our past can impact our ability to be vulnerable with others, especially significant other. And that's why we talk about the intimacy as well. And so we're going to dig in this module to talk about how to have healthy relationships and maybe some of the patterns that you've engaged in as a result of your trauma. If you've been in any kind of relationship in your life, you usually slip into a particular role in relationships. This occurs in every type of relationship with family, friends, significant others. And the role we play is often based on who we are at the core and aligns with our core beliefs. If you remember to that last module when we talked about our core beliefs, some of those false beliefs, a lot of the times the role we play in a relationship is because we have a false belief about ourselves. And if we're working on those things and that exercise where you dig into those core beliefs and we start to learn that we have maybe more self-worth than we thought and we build our confidence, you will find that your role in the relationships are going to change as you change. So I just want to give you some examples. If you struggle with feelings of low self-worth, like I did as a result of my abusive marriage, you might find yourself being that friend that overextends themselves and does everything for someone else. I started to find value in, I need to be needed. I have such low self-worth that when somebody affirms me for being a really good friend and I can just be that person that goes above and beyond at the expense of myself, that's when it starts to become unhealthy. It really got down to that source of that I had a low self-worth. Another example, if you struggle with control, you may find yourself unintentionally manipulating someone's time. You may be that type of friend that, goes back and forth and says, no, I need someone to respond to me right now. I need you to call me in the next 5 minutes. I'm really struggling with something. You just start to get kind of manipulative and controlling about someone else's time. If you struggle with control and you struggle with, some false core beliefs around that. So this isn't a means to condemn you or point out any areas of shortcomings in your life, but just know that if you've worked through those false beliefs and you start to work on your affirmations and your I am statements, the roles that you play in relationships are going to start to change and evolve, and that's a good thing. And we're going to talk just even more layers deep into kind of how relationships function, especially in unhealthy traumas. So here I want to point out the drama triangle. I am not the person who originally designed the drama triangle, but I want to explain the roles in the drama triangle. And it's really interesting as someone who's been in a relationship that was abusive, unhealthy. I immediately thought, I looked at this and I thought, well, I was the victim. But that actually wasn't true all of the time. So we're going to go through this and I'll explain how these roles work. So we'll start with the victim. The victim is manipulative, helpless, and needy. They are complaining all the time. They have feelings of worthlessness. They blame others. They feel powerless. And their kind of quote would be, poor me. I can't do it on my own. The persecutor in the relationship is someone who is angry, aggressive, controlling. They threaten or bully the victim. They criticize, judge, and blame, and they persecute so that they can feel superior. And they're saying, you can't do anything right. It's all your fault. So you think in a lot of, abusive, unhealthy relationships, these are the main two roles in that kind of dynamic. And I can tell you that in my marriage, I definitely was probably the victim more often, and my ex-husband at the time was the persecutor. And unfortunately, that's not where we always stay, because there's this third role in the drama triangle. And this is the one I really want to point out to you, because you might say, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I do that. And that's okay. That's why we're here to talk about it. So the rescuer role, they need to feel important. They have enabling behavior. They're overly helpful, very self-sacrificing. They avoid confronting their own issues. And they say, let me help you. You can't do it on your own. So in the drama triangle, you don't have three people. You have two people, but you switch between these roles, which is why you see the arrows on the screen. So let me give you an example of, an abusive situation that I experienced on a regular basis. It started off with my ex-husband, the persecutor, blaming me for something, yelling at me, pointing the finger, saying, it's all your fault. I would immediately go into the victim role and say, poor me, I'm powerless, and I feel worthless. And sometimes I would quickly slip into the rescuer role. So instead of wanting to be victimized, I would say, you know what? Maybe there's something I can do to help this person right now. So I'm going to figure out how to fix their mood. I'm going to fix whatever's going on, because instead of playing the victim right now, I want to rescue this person. So I wanted to rescue my ex-husband from whatever life situations he was going through. And it avoids confronting the issues that I needed to work on, which was the area of vulnerability. And so it's very enabling behavior. Sometimes the drama triangle can actually start with the victim. So if you're walking around the house moping, poor me, I can't do anything right, I feel just worthless, it basically allows the other person in the relationship to pick one of the other two roles, right? Because this dynamic likes to stay in play. When you have this dynamic going, it perpetually moves. And you perpetually move usually between one of two roles. Sometimes the persecutor becomes the victim. Sometimes the rescuer becomes the victim. Sometimes the persecutor becomes the rescuer. There were definitely times where I was the persecutor in my marriage, and my ex-husband would become the victim. But just keep in mind that if you start to fulfill one of these roles, the other person in that relationship, whether it's a significant other, a family member, a friend, is likely going to fit into one of these other roles if they also don't have healthy coping mechanisms and they have false core beliefs. Because what you're doing is you're creating a situation for them to almost have to take on one of these roles. So I wanted to just start by pointing this out to you to say that if you feel like you are in one of these roles, it's okay. That's what we're going to work through. And I wanted to just point this out again, not to condemn you, but just to point out that this happens in relationships, and it's not something we ever try to create. But a lot of times when there's unhealthy people, then there's an unhealthy relationship. And so that's what we're working on in these modules, is to figure out how to get you healthy so that you can get into healthy relationships and you can recognize when somebody else is being unhealthy and set appropriate boundaries with them. So I hope this makes sense. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me about it, but we can talk ad nauseum at length about the drama triangle and giving you lots of different situations, but I just wanted to bring some awareness to the different types of roles that often play out in a relationship between two people. Now, keeping in mind, this also could be the dynamic in a group of people where certain people take on different roles in this, but this is often seen in a relationship with two people. So why do we set boundaries? Why is this important? It is necessary for self-care to set boundaries, and it's really important for healthy relationships. It also allows us to show respect for ourselves and others, and empowers you to make healthy choices. All right, so what is a boundary? There's a lot of misconceptions about what a boundary is, and some people really dislike that word ultimatum, so we're also going to talk about that. But a boundary is basically a limit you set for yourself. It can involve other people, but the basis of a boundary is what you are going to do. And I want to give you some examples of this. So boundaries help you assert yourself. An ultimatum, on the other hand, explains what you're going to do if that boundary is crossed. So here's an example. Here's a boundary. I'm going to say this. You are talking in a disrespectful manner to me, and I'm asking you to stop. That's asserting myself, saying, this is the boundary I'm setting. I'm asking you to stop right now. I'm not controlling you in this moment. I am saying, this is how you are coming across to me, and my request is that you stop. An ultimatum is the consequence of what's going to happen if that boundary is crossed. So if that person doesn't stop talking to you, you're going to say, if you continue talking to me in a disrespectful way, then I'm going to leave the room. There's no threats in this statement. It's simply what you are going to do. And that's where a healthy ultimatum comes in. There's a lot of unhealthy ultimatums used in relationships. I am guilty of this in my past. Here's an example of one. If you don't seek counseling, I'm going to break up with you. That's a full-on threat. And you better be prepared to follow through with it if you say it, because our words have meaning. They have a lot of weight and they have a lot of meaning. And I found in my experience with unhealthy relationships that when you start to use words without meaning and you drop bombs like this and threats like this and you don't follow through with them, it becomes really detrimental to the relationship. So we don't want to use threats. We want to use healthy ultimatums, which is basically saying, this is my boundary, and if you cross it, this is what I am going to do. And usually that means I'm going to leave the situation, I'm going to hang up the phone, whatever it may be, but you're not telling the other person what they need to do or what next steps they need to take. You're saying, this is my boundary. If you cross it, this is what I'm going to do as a result. Here's an example of a healthy ultimatum instead of the, if you don't seek counseling, I'm going to break up with you. Something needs to change in our relationship. I'm recommending you get counseling. So you can give a recommendation, but it's not saying you have to do this. If something doesn't change in our relationship, then I can no longer be in this relationship. So that again is stating the ultimatum of, I'm saying that something needs to change because my boundary is that I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. And if nothing does change, and again, you have to be willing to do some work yourself too. This isn't well, if you don't change, then I'm leaving. That's a threat. So be careful how you use your words. But it's saying if something doesn't change in our relationship, then I can no longer be in this relationship. And I've actually had to use this statement and say, I'm willing to work on whatever it is we need to work on. I think we both probably need to do some work. But if something doesn't change, I'm going to leave. I'm going to walk away. I can no longer be in this. And then following through on that. And you don't have to say this in a threatening, nasty manner. It's a very matter of fact. This is my boundary. I'm drawing this line in the sand, and this is what I'm going to do. Some of the reasons we struggle with setting boundaries goes back to that core value. Maybe you have a core value that you don't want to let anyone down, or you want to do everything in excellence. And I struggle with this one. I want to always follow through on everything I'm going to say. If I say yes to something and then later on I can't commit to it because I've said yes to too many things, I still want to be in excellence and be in integrity. And so my core value just really tears at me and I actually can't set boundaries for myself. Maybe it's a family upbringing or conditioning. Maybe you observed really poor boundary setting growing up. This is a lot of times what happens for people is that they didn't see this example, displayed in their home life growing up. Maybe there's a role that you're expected to play in your family or society. I was definitely expected to play the rescuer role in a lot of situations growing up. I was kind of the emotional caregiver for my family, and I'm grateful for my family, but just know that because of that role that I played and I was kind of expected to play, I struggled with setting boundaries, and especially in unhealthy relationships with other people. Maybe you have a fear. Maybe it's a fear of rejection. I don't want to set a boundary because I'm afraid they're going to reject me. I'm afraid they're going to leave me. I'm afraid I'm not going to have any friends. I'm afraid I'm going to be alone. Maybe that's another reason you struggle with setting boundaries. And then also, I just want to point out an undefined identity. Maybe you are unaware that you need to set boundaries. because your identity is wrapped up into these unhealthy relationships. And maybe you have an empathetic personality that just wants to be the rescuer for everyone. And then sometimes you find yourself slipping into the victim role as a result. And you just cannot seem to separate yourself from being an empath to setting healthy boundaries. So I just want to highlight some of the reasons that people struggle with this, and just know that if you struggle with it, you're not alone, because I struggled with it for years and I still sometimes slip back into my old ways of this. And that's why we work on it. That's why there's exercises to walk you through this section so that you can have healthy boundaries. I want you to do this just quick self-inventory while you're with me here on the module. And how many of these resonate with you? I'm going to read the list. Sharing too much too soon with people that you meet. Going along with whatever everyone else wants. Responding to text messages immediately, even if you're doing something else. A need to feel needed. Difficulty making decisions. Feeling constant anxiety about the relationship. You'll do anything to make someone happy. Finding no satisfaction or happiness outside of being with a particular person. Feeling guilty when you take time for yourself. You don't feel like you can trust yourself or your emotions. You fear abandonment. You have a strong desire to write someone off if they don't meet your needs. Difficulty identifying your feelings. And you love taking care of people. Feeling like you deserve to be treated poorly because you acted poorly. I can tell you that I probably at one point in my life could resonate with almost every one of these. I think the ones that I struggle with the most now are the need to feel needed, responding to text messages immediately, what else? Guilty if you take time for yourself. Those are probably the top ones that I struggle with right now. But I just want to do this quick self-inventory and see like how many of these resonate with you, because I want to talk about what this means. This is based on a lot of research that I've done, and I want to just highlight this to you. These are actually signs of codependency. And when I first started researching codependency, I didn't really understand what that meant. It's not dependency. A codependency is when you're getting filled up by an unhealthy codependent dynamic. So you may say, well, it's not codependent because they're not dependent on me and I'm constantly pouring into them. And so, but there is this codependency. We aren't made or created to be codependent on anything or anyone, right? Like we do need basic human needs to be met to survive, but we are not supposed to be codependent, even on our spouse. That's actually unhealthy. It's a root cause of why we don't set boundaries in relationships. So if we go back to that previous slide and you think about fearing abandonment, and so if you fear abandonment and you have constant anxiety about the relationship, you have no satisfaction or happiness in your life outside of being with that person, you're probably not going to set healthy, appropriate boundaries as a result of those things going on. So you might find yourself allowing that person to kind of walk all over you. Maybe you allow them to speak to you in an unhealthy way. Maybe you drop everything in the middle of your workday to go bring them something that they forgot they left at home. It's things like that where you're starting to act out of character because your root is in a field of codependency. And so when we are getting filled up by those unhealthy codependent dynamics in the relationship of like, oh, they need me. And so I'm so grateful that I can bring them their lunch that they left at home in the middle of the workday, even though it meant I had to leave work early and my boss wasn't happy about it. I'm so grateful that I could be there for them today and do that. You are getting filled up by that need to be needed. And that other person is crossing boundaries that you didn't set. So I guess they aren't really crossing boundaries, but essentially is creating that codependent dynamic so that they then start to expect those behaviors out of you because you're doing them. So that's where that codependent nature comes in. And we can be codependent on a lot of things other than significant others. I really actually struggled with a codependency on my dog. I know that sounds silly, but I had such a strong desire to be a mom that when I was struggling to have children and I got my dog was everything to me. And it actually didn't help my dog because he ended up with separation anxiety because I just couldn't leave him. I felt so bad. I was constantly thinking about him when I wasn't with him, and just really not setting a healthy boundary between me and my pet. And then when he got sick, my life was destroyed because I had such an unhealthy attachment to him. And it was a codependency. Now, my dog was obviously dependent on me as the owner, as the parent, to feed him, get him his basic needs met. But I had developed a codependency on him because he was fulfilling an emotional need that I was not getting met in my marriage. And so when I lost my dog, it was the most devastating thing for me. And yes, losing a pet is very devastating, but way more so than it should have been. And I went through a serious form of grief because I had such an unhealthy codependent dynamic with my little dog. So I just want to point out that it's not necessarily just significant others. It can be family members, it can be pets, it can be your job, it can be just anything in life that we struggle with codependency. And it's so easy to slip into codependency. And again, I just want to point out that if you do struggle with this, that's why we're talking about it, because I know a lot of people that have been through trauma have struggled with codependency at some point in their life, because a lot of times maybe you didn't have healthy relationships modeled to you, or you end up with feelings of such low self-worth that you find other ways to fill that instead of going to the root of that self-worth, which is usually in shame. So if that's resonating with you, maybe we need to redo the shame module together. Just go through it again, do those exercises, keep doing those core beliefs, because that is really the foundational work for working through that shame and that unworthy feeling that often fuels us into needing codependent relationships. So I just want you to answer this question. Where do you find your identity? Do you find your identity in relationships? Do you find it in being a good friend? Do you find it in your job? When we have our identity in other things and other people, it's a sign of codependency. I used to have an identity in my job. So when I wasn't having enough to do or my calendar wasn't filled, I thought, well, they must not value me and I must not be good at my job, because I had an unhealthy codependency with my job because I found my identity in my job. I thought, if I'm not a good nurse or advanced practice nurse, then what am I in life? And so this led to an unhealthy attachment with my job. So just brainstorm about this for yourself, just to figure out where you find your identity. When you're setting boundaries or ultimatums, it's so important to follow through on what you said you were going to do, like I mentioned before. Why is this so important? First of all, it demonstrates integrity, and it shows honor to yourself and to the other person. And you really want to honor what you say, because it helps build your feelings of self-worth to honor yourself. You can ultimately only be responsible for your own actions at the end of the day. So you really want to set boundaries and say things or, ultimatums that you are going to follow through on. How do I set boundaries? That's a great question. Let's talk about that. So first of all, I want you to recognize where you need to set boundaries. Where are some areas that you need to practice it? Because I want to tell you to first practice it before you do it in the challenging relationships. So maybe it's your time, maybe it's your calendar, maybe it's a boundary you need to set with your phone. I actually recently started doing this. I will turn my phone on Do Not Disturb, and I will not respond to people's text messages immediately, because I have struggled with that for a while. Maybe it's your space. Maybe you invite people into your home nonstop and you don't have any respite. Maybe you need to set boundaries with your emotions. Maybe it's allowing people to influence your emotions in such a way that it just debilitates you. So maybe it's almost like putting guardrails up to other people in a healthy way. We're going to talk more about that too. And then I want you to practice setting those boundaries in safe relationships. First of all, setting them with yourself and saying, you know what, out loud, I'm going to set a boundary with this today and I'm going to follow through. And then maybe it's working on setting boundaries with some people that can hold you accountable. So if you are setting a boundary with, your friends and saying, I have this one friend that really kind of just sucks me dry emotionally. And I find myself just really, anytime they text, I'm like, sure, I'll go do whatever it is you want me to do. Find another friend that you trust and have them hold you accountable. Say, you know what? I need you to check in with me once a week and ask me how I'm doing with that. Or, maybe it's something else, and doing it with people who are going to honor that boundary. So if I say to someone, my boundary is that I'm not going to text back, at least an hour goes by before I respond. If I text back sooner, I need you to call me out on it. And just also note that setting boundaries in abusive relationships may not be a safe thing to do. So if you are in an abusive relationship or a very unhealthy relationship, setting boundaries might not be the easiest thing to do, and it might not be safe. So just practice this in safe relationships where you feel like you can, work on it, gain that confidence and that self-worth that comes from trying this out. When you practice setting boundaries, I want you to start with one area and set a consistent boundary with yourself or someone else. So here's some examples. Putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, like I mentioned. Don't respond to text messages when you're out with friends. Maybe if you're that type of person that just constantly replies, maybe it's saying when I'm out with someone, my phone needs to be in my purse, in my pocket. Set aside 2 hours of time for yourself. Do not agree to do anything, even if someone asks you to help them out, saying, nope, for these 2 hours of the week, it could be the week, I am not going to drop everything and help everybody. I'm not going to have people over. I'm literally going to do whatever I want in those 2 hours. And maybe you need to turn your phone off too. And just really setting aside and just honoring your time. If someone is raising their voice at you, calmly ask them to stop. Say, you're raising your voice right now, I need you to stop. And practice saying that sentence out loud before you get into the situation. A lot of times we know in the areas of our life where we need to set boundaries, we kind of anticipate it might need to happen. So I actually would practice this. I would say it out loud with a particular person that I needed to practice setting boundaries with. I would speak it out loud as I was driving over to their house because I knew it was probably going to come up. So I was like gaining confidence just practicing it. And then I was able to say it when the time came. If someone's pushing you to talk about a particular topic, just say calmly, I don't want to talk about this. So again, maybe you need to practice some of these and just know that this gets easier with time. It took me a long time, like a couple years with one particular individual in my life that I needed to practice setting boundaries with. And it resulted in some pushback, but just practice. It takes time, and just start to just really honor yourself when you do this. Expect pushback, like I mentioned, especially if it's the first time that you've done this. If we're talking somebody you've known for years, a family member, it can go drastically different than you think for that first time. The first time I told someone in my life that I wanted them to stop talking to me like that, I just said, you're raising your voice at me and you need to stop. It was a complete, just got worse, right? Like just 10 times worse. What do you mean I'm raising my voice at you? I'm raising my voice at you. I can talk to you however I want. And so I had to stay really calm, and I had to then come in with the ultimatum. So I was ready to do that. But just know that if you're getting pushback, it's okay. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means that the dynamic of the relationship is changing and the other person probably doesn't like it. You probably have a component of that drama triangle going on, and they might really start to set in on that role of persecutor when you set a boundary. And you're basically saying, I am coming out of that triangle right now. I'm not going to play any of these three roles, and they're not going to know what to do. You might even see them get kind of frantic because it's disrupting the norm of that relationship that you've had. So just know it's not like you're doing anything wrong. It's just part of the dynamic changing. And you're saying, I'm not going to stand for being in any of these roles. So I'm literally coming out of this drama triangle, and they don't know what to do. They don't know what role to play. So it might look kind of messy for a while, and that's okay. I also would encourage you to reflect on this. What feelings are coming up? It can be scary. I can tell you from my experience, it was kind of freaky to set boundary with this one person that I hadn't set boundaries with my entire life. And then what are you noticing in your body? What's happening? Is it bringing up some trauma? A lot of times when you set boundaries and the other person doesn't respect them, it can bring up that fight or flight kind of response. And you're like, oh gosh, this feels a lot like my trauma. That's another reason people avoid this that have been through trauma. So just journal and reflect on this experience and just know that it does get better with time, the more consistency you do with boundary setting. Now I want to talk about values. This is another really important topic when it comes to relationships and intimacy. The definition of values is the set of beliefs or deeply held desires that govern how we make all decisions in life. They show up in how we relate to other people and how we make decisions, and they drive everything we do. Most often our values are instilled at a young age, and sometimes when trauma has occurred, they can become rooted in fear or survival. Most people can list what they value, but there might be some blind spots in this area, which is why we want to talk about it. Keeping in mind that your values are neither right or wrong, but they are simply what you need in life. So when you do this exercise in the workbook, it's okay that you're like, oh gosh, why do I value that? I really wish I didn't value that as highly as I valued one of these other ones. That's okay. It's just how you're made. And it probably has something to do with what happened to you as a child, any traumatic experience that you've had. It's just who you are. Some people need more security and safety than others because they didn't experience that growing up. Some people need more physical touch than others. That's okay, because values reflect what we need and oftentimes are filling a void of something that we didn't get. So we're not talking basic needs like air, food, water, but it's your fundamental emotional needs. I can tell you that my values are integrity, honesty, authenticity, and the reason those are my top three is because those were things I didn't see a lot of growing up. I say that lightly because I did see those things growing up, but I value just people being so real and transparent and honest with me and authentic and being their true self because I never got a chance to be that. Okay, I really struggled with that. When I was my true authentic self, there was something wrong with me growing up. And no faults of my parents, but I was a very unique kid. I had a very different mindset. And back then, in that day and age, they took me to a psychiatrist to figure out what was wrong with me because I thought different than the rest of the family. And the psychiatrist basically told them, Carrie just is gifted and thinks with the right side of her brain instead of the left, when we still used to think that was just only two sides of the brain, that people used one or the other. But I was different and I thought different. I had different ideas. I had different dreams and goals in life. And so being my authentic self is such a strong value of mine because I really struggled to be able to be that when I was a kid. And that's okay because that's just a need that I have that maybe somebody's like, oh, I don't value that nearly as high as you do. That's okay. Identifying your values, the reason we do this exercise is because it can point to what you might be lacking in relationships or life in general. Oftentimes, the things that make up a healthy relationship are people that either have similar values as you do, the top ones, or they are really conscious of trying to meet what you value. So my significant other knows that honesty is so important to me that I want you to tell me everything, even if it's going to hurt my feelings. Like I don't want there to be any secrets. I don't want anything hiding. I don't want you to sugarcoat something. I want you to be truly, brutally honest with me because they know I value that much. So it just can also point to maybe some things that you might be lacking in relationships or even in friendships. When our values are not met, we find ourselves in the same patterns of behavior, and then we seek things to fill the void. When my values were not met, like let's say physical touch was a high value of mine in relationship, and that need was not met in my marriage. It's actually my number one love language. And my ex-husband refused to touch me, refused to cuddle, hold my hand, any of that. And I was so desperately needing physical touch that I sought that elsewhere. And then I carried a lot of shame for doing that. So keeping in mind that the reason we look at our values is because it can help us point to, wow, that value has never been met in my relationships with significant others. And I find myself dating the same kind of person over and over. And I wonder why that is, because I'm seeking to fill some void. But now I know that this is a value of mine, so I can seek out somebody that also values that or that's willing to meet that value of mine. Because throughout the course of life, you probably have experienced times when your values were not met. And it really comes from ourselves to rely on that. We are ultimately responsible to honor our own values and not look to others to meet those needs. But if you are in a relationship, that person should try to meet your values, right? They should have some similar core values. You cannot rely on somebody else to meet those needs. That's when that codependency comes in the work situations, friendships, and intimate relationships. So you have to figure out ways to honor your own values, but also be able to seek out that in a relationship and know how to articulate your values, which is why we do these exercises. So how do you honor your values? Keep setting boundaries and recognize that it's going to take time to change behavior and expectations. One of the greatest things I learned in therapy was that I often had unrealistic expectations of other people. And this comes from my core value of integrity and honesty, that I believe everybody should do the right thing all the time. That's what I believe. And I found that I was actually expecting other people to have that same value as mine, which meant I was going to have a lot of unmet expectations and a lot of disappointments, hence the disappointment section in the module about triggers and flashbacks. And so just know that when you're setting boundaries, you're not going to change someone else's behavior. The goal is not to do that. The goal is to change your role in the relationship and to honor your own values as a result. So recognize when your values are not being honored and how you can work to honor them from within. If you're saying, you know what, I think in order to honor this value of mine, I can't surround myself with those kinds of people. That's okay. That's setting a healthy boundary for yourself and saying it's going to cause me too much headache and stress and it's going to cause me to slip into unhealthy codependency. Great. Then honor your own value and know that about yourself. Consider individual coaching, especially if you struggle with codependency. There's a lot of steps involved. If you feel like you really are kind of deep into a codependent relationship or you've like, oh, I have battled with this my whole life, there's definitely individual coaching available for that. And then practice self-care regularly, which we're going to talk a lot more about in the next module. So thank you for staying with me on this one. I know this was a hard one for some people, especially if there were some new revelations about patterns of behavior. And I just hope that you really got a lot of material out of this. There's so much more we could cover in relationships and intimacy. So if you are interested in individual coaching about this, definitely a path we can take. But next up, we are going to do the last module in this course and really dig into self-love. After you've worked through those feelings of shame and worthlessness and figured out how to set healthy boundaries in relationships, we have to really set a framework for self-love and just the next steps in your healing journey. So stay tuned with me for the next module.